Hello, and welcome to our second presentation on Early Latin morphology. My name is Giuseppe Pezzini, and I teach and research on Early Latin language and literature at the University of St. Andrews. In this presentation, I will first talk about nominal inflection. Nominal inflection, we may say, is the addition of suffixes or endings to nominal roots and stems to create forms of the same word with distinct grammatical meaning. I will first talk today about the patterns of inflection of nouns, also known as declensions, or pronouns, and then of adjectives, also known as classes. Finally, in this presentation, I will also consider the formation of adverbs. This cannot be properly described as a nominal inflection, but in some sense it is analogous in many respects, as you will see. Let us start with inflection of nouns. In Early Latin, suffixes can be added to nouns to express a combination of grammatical meanings, above all number and case, but in some cases also gender. In Early Latin, there are two numbers, singular and plural. But there are also some very few vestiges of an old dual, which we can see, for instance, in the form ambo. Singular forms can also be used sometimes in a collective or generic sense, like Romanus, meaning the Romans, and there are also some plural forms that have singular meaning, the so-called pluralia tantum, like castra, the camp. And none of these, in a way, have morphosyntactic consequences. Cases, instead, express the grammatical function of the word in the syntax of the phrase and clause. Early Latin preserves 7 of the 8 securely reconstructible cases of Proto-Indo-European, that is, nominative, vocative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and, with some restrictions, locative. Only the instrumental case of Proto-Indo-European has been merged with the ablative, but there are some vestiges of this even in Early Latin, as in the form quicum. As in most Indo-European languages, Early Latin had 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. 5 patterns of inflection, or declensions, are traditionally recognized for Early Latin, distinguished according to the characteristic morpheme. The first declension is characterized by the morpheme a, which is found in most forms of the stem, as you can see in the table over there. This was originally a feminine morpheme, and most of the words of the first declension are indeed feminine nouns. But there are several exceptions, like for instance the masculine noun agricola, which means farmer, but even these forms most likely derived originally from a personalization of feminine abstracts, like agricola meaning originally not farmer but field work. In the slide, you can see the table of the declension for the different cases and the different numbers. Many of the endings following the a, the case endings, will be found again in other declensions. I can point your attention, for instance, to the typical m of the accusative, the lengthened vowel of the ablative, or the room ending of the genitive plural. As you can see in the table, for some particular cases, more than one form is attested. This is because the morphology of Early Latin is much less uniform than in the artificial grammar codified for Classical Latin. Variants of the same form are often attested, sometimes even in the same author, possibly with a different diachronic origin and quite often with a different synchronic stylization. For instance, for the genitive singular, 4 forms or even 5, 6, 7 forms are attested. First, the form as. Second, the form ai as 2 syllables. Then I as a monosyllable, as a diphthong. Ae, finally, as a monotongue as well. As is the oldest form, which is preserved in Early Latin only in fossilized formulas. For instance, we find it in the expression pater familias, familias being an old genitive. Then we have the form ai, disyllabic, which is a secondary form, which was created by analogy with the genitive ending of the second declension, the form e, which was taken from the second declension and moved to the first. This kind of form is metrically reconstructed in Plotos. Third stage, we may say, is the form ai monosyllabic. This derives from the former form, from ai disyllabic, by a normal standard process of phonological reduction, the monophthongization. This I is the standard spelling attested in early description, and presumably was the form also used by Plautus, as suggested by some metrical and orthographical considerations. Finally, we also have the form I, monosyllabic, a diphthong, which is a natural development of monosyllabic I. This form is first attested in inscription about the 180 BC. So we see how great is the variety of forms in this particular period. But there is more than that, because there are also other forms attested for the genitive singular, that is the forms AS, the form I, and the form E, which is a monophthongization of the form I. I put these forms in the brackets because they are rarely attested in inscriptions, but they would have presumably been used in the spoken language, although with a low register, regional or substandard ring. You can see from the table that also an optional variant is attested for the ablative singular, the form ad, with the original ending de. This is attested in a line of the poet Naevius. This form, ad, just like the genitive I, 2 syllables, was probably obsolete in early speech and had in writing a high archaism stylization. Different forms may be attested in the same author, but not all of them, as I said many times by now, have the same stylization. For the plural, very briefly, I will only note the variants eis and is, which is related to the standard change in early Latin, which is the monophthongization of a. This started in an early period, but was not completed until later times. And in fact, we are pretty sure that Cicero himself may have used this form. There are also optional variants for other forms, but I don't have much time, so I think it's time to move on. Second declension is characterized by an original or thematic vowel and can be divided in 3 subclasses. The first, which includes usually masculine and sometimes feminine nouns, has a nominative ending in us and a vocative ending in e. The second subclass, which also includes masculine nouns, has a nominative and vocative ending in r, to which the other endings are attached. These forms in r derive themselves from a regular syncope of an original os ending after r, as we can see, for instance, in the form vesper, which comes from vesperos, with syncope of the final syllable. The third subclass includes neuter nouns and is characterized by the ending m for singular nominative and accusative, and the ending a, short a, for the plural. These endings are also found in other declensions, as we will see. Also for the second declension, early Latin features optional variants, which however, as the one we discussed before, had quite often different stylization, both synchronically and diachronically. For instance, the old ending of the nominative os, which in inscriptions is normally found without the s as o, is relatively common. But it's quite clear, or seems to be clear, that this form in os or o was already stylized as an archaism form in the early period. In fact, forms in us, the standard form we also found in classical Latin, are already attested at the very beginning of the early period, and were probably well established by Plautus' time. Another example is the original ending of the genitive in instead of orum, which is attested in early Latin, but is normally restricted to a small set of terms as a kind of fossilized feature, for instance in genitive plural nostrum or in the form deum for deorum, or sometimes it's also found in other forms, but seems to be associated with either emphatic or archaism speech. And I can give you an example from my author, the author I work on, who is Terence. And in Terence we do find a few cases of this old genitive in but they seem to be typical of the speech of all men, which in Terence are characterized by archaism and old-fashioned speech. I can now move to the third declension, which derives from the merging of 2 originally different groups, nouns with a consonant stem and nouns with an e stem. The first group, which you can see in that table over there, includes nouns ending in a range of different consonants. The nominative form was originally formed by the word root in consonant followed by the final s. We can see that, for instance, in the form iems, where we have the word root, hiem, meaning winter, followed by the final s. The same word root is also found then in the genitive. However, this kind of consonantal cluster, consonant and final S, often appears in early Latin in a different form, which underwent phonological changes or reduction. So for instance, for the form consul, consulis, the nominative is not consuls, with the vowel root followed by a S, because the consonantal cluster LS is simplified. There are many different cases of this time. So since there's been this kind of phonological changes, if we want to reconstruct what is a stem form, it's always better to start from the genitive. So to give you another example, if you want to know what is in early Latin the word stem for the noun miles, militis, soldier, we wouldn't start from the nominative miles, which has undergone a phonological reduction, but we will start with the genitive for milit is. The root stem milit is the one to which all the other endings are then attached. The table in the slide shows an overview of the endings of the second declension for both the masculine, feminine and the neuter forms. I have excluded the locative because it's not so well attested for the third declension. Optional variants are attested in early Latin also for the third declension, as you can see in the table. Also in the case of the nominative. To give you an example from the nominative, for instance, for the nominative of the noun lacte, originally, which means milk, we do find the old form lacte, the full form, with the ending e, but we also find the more classical form lac, with syncope of final syllable. There are also many different prosodical variants, which are all related to the shortening of final vowels, which is one of the most important phonological changes of early Latin, which I discussed, if you remember, a couple of classes ago. To give you an example, in early Latin we do find both the form soror with the original long O, soror, but quite often we also find the reduced shortened form soror with a final O. The next tables in the next two slides show the overview of nouns in the E stem. In this stem, we have for the nominative this ending is, which however in some cases appears in a different form, either with R or with L. And this is because forms originally ending in eris or ale are normally found syncopated. So for instance, we do not find normally the form animal, le, with the final e, but we find a syncopated for animal. Optional variants are also tested for this class of the third declension. I can note in particular the variant forms for the accusative singular and plural, so we find either im or em, and in the plural is or s. There are also some variant forms in the case of the ablative singular, which in some cases appears with the expected form e, with a long e, but we also have cases of the old form ending in final d, which we have already seen also for the other declensions, and in some cases we also find an analogical form in final short e, which derives from analogy with the first class of the third declension. In this class, one should also include a number of words ending in long s, as you can see, deriving from an original ace. An example of this is the noun kaides. Time is running short, and I will have to discuss the other topics at a greater speed. The fourth declension is characterized by the morpheme u, as you can see in the table, whereas the fifth declension is characterized by the morpheme e, a long e. You can see a simplified overviews of both declensions in these two tables. As you can see from these tables, there are many optional variants also for this class. Here, I will only note that in early Latin, there are in fact very few nouns belonging to these declensions, and in several cases there are fourth declension and fifth declension nouns that are also attested, or perhaps mainly attested, with endings of other declensions. For instance, to give you an example from Plotus, in Plotus, nouns of the fourth declension are in almost all cases found with a genitive in a, e, as you can see from the table there in the brackets. I will also say that in early Latin in general, the very common noun domus, which in classical Latin takes endings of the fourth declension, in fact is usually found in early Latin with second declension endings. There are a few exceptions, but in general, the endings are those of the second declensions. Let us move now to the inflection of adjectives, which will require a few words from me since it is essentially based on nominal inflection. There are two classes of adjectives in Early Latin. The first class includes adjectives that have different endings for all three genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. Masculine and neuter forms follow the ending system of the second declension. So, for instance, we have bonus and bonum and altus and altum. Feminine forms instead follow the ending system of the second declension, like bona and alta. In the second class, there seems to be already a distinction for some types of adjectives between masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. Just to give you an example, from the form acer, we seems to find acer masculine, acris feminine, and acre neuter. I said it seems that we find it because in fact there is a kind of trend of standardization for this kind of process. In Plautus, for instance, we do find cases in which acer seems to be used as a feminine, not very clear, but we also find cases in which acris seems to be used as a masculine. At the end of the period, through Terence and Lucilius, instead, this tripartition between masculine and feminine neuter form seems to be established. But there are many other adjectives for which this tripartition of gender is not established, and we do find a form like lenis for both the masculine and the feminine, and lene only for the neuter. In some classes of adjectives of this second class, we do find instead only one form for both the three genders, like felix for the masculine, feminine, and neuter. As you could already guess, adjectives of this class are formed according to the ending system of the third declension: acer, acris, 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 felix, felicis in this case. I still need to talk about the inflection of pronouns. This is a very complex topic because many pronouns in Early Latin, given their high occurrence, have developed a quite idiosyncratic paradigm. In this slide, I've given you a sample of a very common pronoun which somehow illustrates the main features of the declension of pronouns. In particular, I can note the genitive in ius and the dative in I. As you can see, the main difference for the nominal inflection is that there's a kind of merging between different declensions found for noun. As you can see, even just from this table, which gives you an overview only of one single pronoun, there were in Early Latin optional variants also of pronouns, and in fact indeed many of them. So for instance, for ipse we find two nominatives, ipse and ipsus. We find two kinds of accusative, ipsum and eumse, with one of them with analogy. And we also find prosodic variants, like the genitive ipsius is found either as ipsius with a long e, or as ipsius with a sort of synethesis of e and u. Finally, a few words on the adverbial system. In Early Latin, adverbs are formed in many different ways, but one can identify, we may say, two main classes of adverbs that have a kind of regular inflection. These are the adverbs in e, a long e, and adverbs in iter. Adverbs in e normally derive from adjectives of the third class. For instance, from the adjective doctus or longus, we have the adverbs docte and longe. Adverbs in iter instead normally derive from adjectives of the second class. For instance, from the adjective lenis, we have the adverb leniter. I said normally because in fact there are many cases in which this rule that you see in the slide is not respected. I'll give you some example from Plautus. We have amiciter from amicus. We don't find it as amica in Plautus, but we find it as amiciter. Avariter is the same, or servitor. All these adverbs in iter come from corresponding adjectives of the first class. Here, therefore, you have another proof, one of the others I've tried to give you today, that Early Latin morphology is not as regular and monolithic as one might think. And yet this does not mean that there are no trends of standardization also in Early Latin. It's a linguistic anarchy, but which is also accompanied by standardization trends. Indeed, There are many optional variants, which you have seen today, which are clearly stylized. They don't have the same neutral stylization. There are, in fact, some authors who avoid some of the optional forms I've discussed today. And a clear example is, for instance, the language of my author, Terence, in which most of the optional variants that I have discussed today are actually not found. In fact, the morphology, the nominal morphology of Terence, is almost as standardized as it seems to be in artificial classical Latin. Thanks for listening. Our next class will focus on the final part of morphology, this verbal inflection. As we say in early Latin, vobis ago gratias.